Yeah, this is for Polly and Zina. Could you talk a little bit about what you see as the intersections between Mormon and Catholic spiritualities?
You go right ahead.
I can't speak for Mormons, but it just seems to me that the Mormons I have gotten to know over the past 25 years, a lot of them have been truly spiritual people. I've been very impressed. And I don't see it that different from Catholic spiritualism. It's a kind of some center of realizing that there's something beyond us. And the words may be different, but and maybe even the approach different, but it's basically very similar.
I think for me, medieval Catholic spirituality is more like modern Mormon spirituality than modern Catholic spirituality is like modern Mormon spirituality. I think that Mormonism having its genesis after the Age of Enlightenment puts it in a different category, especially because it is neighbors with so many Protestant faiths, and it uses their vocabulary more. But as Polly said, the awareness of something beyond us is far more mystical and enchanted, I would say. In medieval Catholicism and modern Mormonism, there's an embrace of the immediate dialogue with, otherworldly creatures there that is, I think, for both modern Catholics and Protestants, a little more maybe private, and that public expression relies much more on an ecumenical appeal to things like reason and rationality and common humanity, whereas medieval Catholics and modern Mormons would just say, well, God told me, this was my immediate experience with a dead ancestor or with one of the saints or something. Joan of Arc saw those 3 saints come and tell her what to do to win the war, and so she did. And Joseph Smith saw those figures in the wood, and they told him to dig up a book and translate, and so he did. And there's a kind of adamance to that, and a kind of it's like ocular proof that sort of begins with it doesn't begin with, it's a human nature thing, but the ideas of reliquaries and having some evidence, this was a piece of the true cross, this was a thorn from the crown of thorns, and it has all of the power thereof, of the entire crown, of this sort of an object that had a physical presence in salvation history. And if, when I talk about relics to my BYU classes, I sort of make a point of saying, and it was one of the church fathers that said, relics are so out of control now that if we gathered up all the pieces of the true cross, we'd be able to make a fleet of Noah's Ark. And he said that in the 12th century. But, and I get a little chuckle from my BYU students, and they say, yeah, it's a good thing we don't worship relics, huh? We don't have any of that. We don't wear crucifixes, right? How many of you are wearing a CTR ring? Guilty hands go up, and I say, okay, we're human, right? We're not us versus them. We belong to the same. But the thing that is interesting about it is that because of its, probably because of its youth, because of its babiness, Mormonism is still really entranced by that collapsed sacred distance, that man, the holy is right here in our face. And I think that is a real commonality between, when I study Marjorie Kemp or Julian of Norwich or Richard Rolla, it was right in their face, and they were out, shouting about it and preaching and teaching about it. And apparently that's what some of our Mormon ancestors did too, before the advent of microphones.
I'd like to just add one more little thing. it seems to me that well, one time I was on an MHA tour that went to Mountain Meadows, and there were two buses that went, and the leaders was Rick Turley was in one and Ron Walker, and they were two of the three authors who wrote the history of the Mountain Meadows massacre, called Massacre at Mountain Meadows. So Rick is eternally happy. As his secretary says, it's just a birth defect. And maybe partly because he was born in Texas, I don't know. But certainly Ron Walker was, when telling the story of what happened and the events that happened, was it was destroying him. It was really, really, really hard. And so Father Dan and I've talked about, so why is this? I mean, Catholics don't get upset about the Inquisition, and yet that was pretty darn horrible. And so obviously the Mountain Meadows Massacre was a whole lot closer in history, but we thought it was also the way Mormons look at families and the importance of family and the spirituality that's carried through families. And Mormons and Catholics don't have that same, the eternal family view. And so maybe that's one area where they differ.
I have a question for Matt and Bradley. Actually, a couple of questions, if you don't mind. One, when it comes to the polemic, the 19th century and early 20th century polemic against Mormonism, which is a way to, especially from the Catholic side, to be polemic against the whole of Protestantism, kind of looking at Mormonism as one of the results of Protestantism. Since we are at a time where mainstream Protestantism is becoming split in relation to its responses to the Enlightenment, right? We have more of a liberal Protestantism and a fundamentalism that emerges at that time. I'm wondering if you've noticed in your research that there is a closer association of Mormonism with one or with the other when it comes to the polemic. And the other question that I had, this is more of a 20th century, if you've come across this. I'm just curious, we talked about McConkie and the association of the Catholic Church with a great and abominable church. When do you see things starting to change after that? Is there a document that would be the first denial of that afterwards, or some statements? I'm just curious about the whole history of that association. Thank you.
Just clarification on that first question. So you're saying with which branches of Protestantism are
Right.
20th century Catholics identifying Mormons?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, my research my research hasn't really covered much in the 20th century. When I was digging into these periodicals, I was amazed at how the continuity of the Catholic critique of Protestantism that utilized Mormonism from 1830 to 1930. That's as far as I went. But I was amazed at how similar Catholics were talking about Mormons in the 1920s as in the 1830s. But I didn't go much beyond then, and that's right when the split is starting to happen that you described in Protestantism. So I'm not sure. I can think about it while Matt gives his response.
I got nothing.
How about that second question? The second question is turning point in the Mormon perception and approach to Catholics.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that I've really looked into. I mean, I think there actually hasn't been a lot of scholarship on sort of Mormon Catholic interactions, use of each other in the 20th century, and sort of how we get from the types of things we were talking about in the 19th century to the type of interaction perceptions that you see today, right? That are quite radically different. So Mara was asking about Bruce R. McConkie's statement in Mormon Doctrine, which was published 1957, thereabouts. And again, I haven't looked at this in a long time, but my impression is that if you look under Whore of Babylon, you'll see it says see Catholic Church, right? And it makes this very explicit identification. And my understanding is that in the next edition of Mormon doctrine, that language is softened, right? That shift, the pushback that McConkie receives is already there. Is that correct? Am I correct in this? Yeah, so it's taken out. So you see, everyone in this audience knows the question better than myself. So it's taken out.
Yeah, we always heard that David O was looking for the woodshed.
Yeah, I don't know about the woodshed itself, but there's definitely pushback at the time. It's changed. But I think in the 20th century, you do see these competing interpretations of what that means, right? And I think there's still this discussion in Mormonism about what does that mean, right? And I think there's still a tendency among some Mormons to read that and view that as meaning Catholicism, right? In my own sort of ecclesiastical experience, I taught those sections in First Nephi, and someone said, "Oh, that's clearly the Catholic Church," right? And this was a couple of years ago, right? So that interpretation clearly clearly existed throughout the 20th century. This idea that the Catholic Church is the Whore of Babylon, but then there's also, I think, been countervailing tendencies throughout the 20th century, and you see that in the pushback against McConkie, even at the moment that it's published. And I'll refer you to one other article by Gary Topping, which was that he's done this really interesting article, I think it was in the Journal of Mormon History a few years ago, that talks about the interaction between David O. McKay, who's the Mormon Church president in the 1950s, and the Catholic Bishop of Salt Lake at that time, and how that interaction, which was is helping change some of these things. So that kind of connection between the rhetoric and the interaction on the ground.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that, and I'm sure you already know this, external developments in Mormon in American politics, I think, from what I can tell, are just as important as these internal developments in Mormon perceptions. And from what I can tell, sociologists of religion kind of track the realignment of Protestant, Catholic, and Mormon, etc., responses to each other with the restructuring of American politics, where these religious groups start to feel like allies against what they perceive as the rise of more secularist politics. So I think there's a robust literature on that. So I think those external factors are just as important.
And the other big thing that you see going on in thinking about these kind of Mormon-Catholic relations and perceptions of each other is what I quoted Samuel Mazzucchelli saying, Catholicism protects against Mormonism. But of course, there's been sort of this shift within Mormon missionary work beginning, in the 1950s and in the 1960s, where the most successful areas have been Catholic nations, right? Have been Latin America, have been the Philippines, other places where there's traditional strength, and of course you see the rise of evangelical Christianity in those nations roughly at the same time. So I'm not quite sure how that plays in to this whole question of Mormon Catholic dialogue, Mormon Catholic relations, but I think it's really important, right? That there's been this real shift in Mormon missionary work and focus. It was true that in the 19th century, missions to Catholic nations were largely failures, right? And that's just not true in the second half of the 20th century.
Questions for Matt, just real quickly.
Yeah.
I was really interested in this Orestes Bronson.
Yeah.
While some of the speakers were talking, I quickly perused the internet and looked at some of the online biographies of him.
Yeah.
He appears to be a couple years older than Joseph Smith,
Yeah.
and then when Joseph Smith's 12, he moves to Syracuse in New York. all I could find is that he bounced around from religion to religion until he's 40 years old. Then he joins the Catholic Church. And then in the 50s, he writes Spirit Rapper. Are you aware of anything that he actually knew the Smiths?
You know,
I can't put him within 150 miles of them.
right.
So.
I mean, he's from Vermont, like the Smiths, right? They're
Yeah.
sort of trailing each other. You know, he has this. I mean, it's sort of this fictionalized autobiography, the Spirit Rapper, and the narrator claims to know Joseph Smith, claims to know all these Mormon elders. Now, in his life itself, I haven't seen any evidence that he was acquainted with Joseph Smith. I mean, I did try to make that connection, and it doesn't seem that the evidence is there. I mean, it certainly he knows about Mormonism from an early stage. I mean, right, he's on the ground in that region in New York when the church gets founded and things like that.
Interesting stuff. Thank
Yeah.
you so much for introducing me to that.
And the brother Orrin, I mean, they do have this correspondence back and forth. It's at the Notre Dame archive now. Orrin doesn't seem to stick around within Mormonism all that long. He kind of disappears. He's one of these historical figures that I couldn't trace very long. But certainly from the correspondence you can tell that Augustus knows a lot about Mormonism. He's interested in his brother's conversion, that sort of thing.
Maybe I can use the moderator's prerogative and ask you a question. I know that historically there were tensions between Mormons and Catholics based on problematic vocabulary differences in the way we use vocabulary in tradition. So I'm wondering, this is for all of you, maybe how maybe vocabulary, there have been miscommunications and problems between two religions, either personally or historically. You can address that a bit.
I had some fun times with the word visitation when I was reading Catholic stuff. Turns out that visitation meant, a bishop or a pope visiting someone. It did not mean God. Another one that was fun was that translation did not mean, taken bodily from the earth, but was the bodily removal of the relics of a saint from one place to another. So, Mary Magdalene's relics were translated to this other place, and I thought, my goodness, really? That was strange. We had a couple of I had some run-ins where people at Catholic U overhearing my discussion with another Mormon about something, I think it was about deacons or something, but it was not the Catholic idea of deacons. And what was the other one? I'll think of it. I'm blocking the last one. I know that there was one that was a pretty hilarious misuse of a similar word for something very different. It may have been as simple as sacrament, where there are 7 sacraments, and then we have it specifically for, for our communion service, and that didn't go well with the discussion I had once, but I can't remember the context. But yeah, we have had a lot. There's borrowings of the vocabulary without an understanding of the historical background of the word, or how its usage in a particular case. Oh, there is a wonderful word in liturgy that I think is remarkable, and I really, really wish that it was the way I want it to be. But if you spell ostentation with 2 S's, it means the showing of the bones. It's when you open the reliquary and you prove that, yes, it does contain something. And so, for a feast day of a saint or something, they would have an ostentation. And I just love the idea of ostentatious being proven you've got the bones, but it doesn't work. That different spelling, so.
I had one experience after doing Mormon history I've been doing this 25 years, and I thought I knew quite a bit, not everything by any means. And in some paper I wrote, I was talking about proxy baptism, and So I wrote that was baptizing the dead, and it was a Community of Christ fellow who said, not baptizing the dead, baptizing for the dead. He said, they're not baptizing bones. So it's that kind of miscommunication that, it was a fine point I had never taken in.
Tell me if you agree with this, but my sense is that that kind of unfamiliarity with each other's theological vocabularies is kind of a 20th century thing. I don't know when this changes, but from what I can tell from my research in the 19th century, everybody's very familiar with each other's theological vocabularies, and I think that's for two reasons. I think it's because mainstream periodicals are filled with polemical debates that we don't really exchange in the public sphere anymore, and not just in print, but oral debates were hugely popular. E. Brooks Holyfield has this great social history of oral debate in 19th century America as a form of popular entertainment. He's able to show that even people on the ground were able to engage in these really sophisticated theological debates, and he includes Mormons in his research, Restorationists, Disciples, Methodists, all Catholics, and they're all debating with each other, and it's a popular form of entertainment. So I don't know when exactly this shift happens, but I don't sense any of that kind of unfamiliarity and miscues based on illiteracy with each other's theological vocabularies in the 19th century. And I think that's because of print and oral debate that was so popular. That's from what I can tell.
Do you think it's also partly the secularization of America? That there's just not that same basic biblical knowledge and vocabulary?
Maybe, yeah. I don't know. We certainly don't seem to use theological debate as a form of popular entertainment anymore. And it doesn't seem to be a part of our mainstream periodicals. What that means in terms of secularization, I'm not sure, but definitely doesn't seem to be a part of our public discourse as much.
Yeah, I run across biblical allusions all the time that seem to have been something that 19th century Americans understood that I have no idea about, and I think, well, I'm a religious studies scholar and I've read the Bible, right? But I don't feel like I'm as biblically literate as many 19th century Americans, right? I mean, it was just a different sort of culture that was just suffused with religious imagery,
technical theological vocabulary.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The reason I brought up that question is Gary Coffey had a really good example of that in his article, where he talks about how the Catholic diocese, was it a diocese here?
Yeah.
They had a pamphlet that they published called a Religious Mission Abroad. And of course, the Mormons, meaning a mission there, was proselyting. So the Mormons took great offense. The Catholics were trying to police the flock. And in reality, the Catholics were just trying to raise money for an underfunded parish. So,
and it's also because they established priests to go visit places that didn't have a church or priests, and they just would call it a mission, not a church or something or other. But it was misunderstood, yeah.
I have another question, if you don't mind. I'm also a crypto-Catholic Mormon, besides the fact that it's in my DNA because I was born and raised in Italy as a Latter-day Saint. But I studied for a year at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, so surrounded by Catholics. A lot of curiosity about Mormonism because I was in a setting, in the international world, there's not as much known about Mormonism. But one of the experiences that I had I wanted to share with you and ask you what your thoughts were. Towards the end of my time there, one of the Jesuit professors, a Hungarian priest, I was talking to him and I was really telling him about how much I was going to miss the place and how great of a time I had. And he told me, be careful, don't romanticize Catholicism too much. And he started to be open about some of the issues, going on there. And the interesting thing is that I invited him to BYU. the following year, and he came, and we were having a similar kind of conversation at the end, and it was like, oh, this place is heaven, this is wonderful, you know, the students are so great. And I ended up saying the same thing to him. Well, be careful, don't romanticize Mormonism too much, we're not perfect, you know, and so forth. So my question is, to what extent do you think that this kind of authenticity, of being open with our own faults with the other, will facilitate a Catholic and Mormon dialogue, and maybe how it has done so in your experiences?
I must say, I was thinking about why aren't there more outsiders interested in Mormon history? And I think a lot of it has to do with a steep learning curve. To understand Mormonism and some of the beliefs, I mean, even today, I think, really? I didn't know that. And so it took me maybe 10 years before I could feel that I had a fair grasp of at least the history and some of the beliefs. But I think you're right. I think talking about where we're not perfect, and what we struggle with in each tradition, is a valuable thing, definitely. And you know, I think Catholics maybe are more willing to talk that because of they've got such a long history, and there are a lot of things, bad things that have happened, but a long time ago. And Mormons, I think, are maybe more sensitive to being open about some of the problems. I don't know. I would hope that we could discuss, because then ultimately we're human beings and we have similar problems.
I think that same kind of question came up at the Mormon Catholic Conference at Notre Dame a year and a half ago. And I think it was Richard Bushman who was kind of asking his Catholic colleagues to kind of act as shepherds to Mormons, to help them to share what the insights they had gleaned, the wisdom they had gleaned, cautions for their process of dealing with their own past, and what's lost and what's gained in the course of that understanding. So I see that as maybe the kind of relationship where Catholics can help us and warn us against pitfalls and help us understand the insights they've gleaned from their experience of dealing with their past, which they've been at it a lot longer.
Yeah, that's the point I was going to make, is that there's, you know, the history of Catholicism is the history of a lot of Europe. It's just so tied together that to study art, culture, politics is to study the religion, or to study, you know, stuff that was influenced by or touched or driven by religious ideologies that were usually Catholic, that were coming from there. So the fact that there's just enormous quantities of information and textual stuff and witnesses and you know, artistic expressions, etc., of those ideas going back for over 1,000 years instead of a couple of hundred years is part of it. But then the fact that as that source of so much power, both in the secular world as well as, you know, as well as religiously, there were more people to record that, even people that disagreed with it. There were people, you know, there were Muslims and Jews and other outsiders that could also observe what the Catholics were doing. And once the Mormons made themselves pretty insular, then it was kind of, there's what the Mormons are up to according to the Mormons, and what the Mormons are up to according to people that don't like the Mormons. And so there isn't a place for as big a tradition of just recording it. And so with the Mormon Church sort of controlling the spin for a long time, it divides into those, you know, really polemical camps of what you were talking about, and what Others mentioned about you're either for us or you're against us, and that's not necessarily the case with all of European history, or all of Western European history at least. So there's more sort of oversight of the Catholic experience in general, I think, and much less of that where the hierarchy has a really tight control over the message, and that really does have to sort of break down after a while, that in order for a balance to be struck, and that, I think that comes later, and it's kind of amazing that it's happened at all for us yet. If you want to look at the extent of Catholic history being so huge, and then Mormon history being so small, it's I think a very encouraging sign that we have, probably just because of the printing press and the computer and everything, arrived at a place of opening as soon as we have.
I think there's also a little corollary in about how open are Catholics among themselves and Mormons among themselves. And it just strikes me, and I may be wrong about this, that Mormons don't allow much place for doubt. If you doubt, then something's going wrong. And I've had a Catholic priest tell me, if you don't doubt, you're brain dead. And I think so that kind of a different tolerance maybe among Catholics for a wider range of views than the Mormons have. So I think it's kind of works both ways, each revealing where they have problems, but also among themselves.
And it strikes me too that so some of that has to do with the length of time of the tradition, right? The maturity of the tradition, the size of the tradition, right? I mean, in talking about these questions of Mormon Catholic dialogue, we've got to remember that Catholicism is here, and here's this pinprick Mormonism, right? In terms of size, in terms of history, all of this sort of thing. So I mean, my sense is that Mormons might have more invested in this type of dialogue with Catholicism because of what Catholicism is. It's a true world religion, right? And where you're going to interact with Catholicism anywhere, right? Than Catholics do with sort of a dialogue with Mormons. And I think you've seen changes there just over the past couple of decades, as Bradley sort of alluded to, right? This sort of rise of these kind of shared moral concerns in Vatican Conference on the Family and all this sort of thing. But I sense that there's been a real sort of intense outreach to Catholic leaders by the Mormon Church and that sort of thing. There's a question back here.
Thank you. I want to ask Polly and Zina. Polly, you had mentioned Lavina Fielding Anderson had been helpful to you, and some of the contemporary feminist work on the internet. And how do you feel there's promising trends for women in both religions? Or, I mean, I think of the recent excommunication of Kate Kelly, and I'm wondering if do you think things are promising, or do you think things are kind of staying the same regarding women's issues?
I have absolutely no idea. I really don't. There was just an excommunication of a Catholic woman who was ordained like last week. She got all the way to ordination and then was excommunicated. But these are both really conservative patriarchal religions, and I don't have any prophetic powers to see what might happen with women's issues in either one of them.
In my parish back in Seattle, so women are not priests and they can't be deacons, but I see that as a possible thing that might change over time. But there are women in everything else. There's one time we had We didn't have a regular priest, so we had a parish administrator who was a nun, but it could have been a lay person. We have women on the church council, which is kind of makes decisions about our particular parish. They're women, girls can be altar servers, so they're females there up at the altar. Women can read from the Bible for the readings, not the gospel, but for the Old Testament and usually letters from Paul. So there are places for them and influence for women. And I don't know about every Catholic church, the dioceses are pretty independent. So, and Seattle's a liberal place. So I don't know about Cincinnati, for instance, what would happen there.
I think there's a question in here. Zina, your little bit about comparing moments in Catholicism with Mormonism and stuff, and you mentioned gening and establishing dialogue as Society of Jesuits, or whatever. I'm just trying to, one of my hopefulness is that the longer Mormonism is around, the more options might become available to us for ways of being Mormon. For instance, if we feel like we're called to a cloistered lifestyle or something, those types of possibilities, that we would actually see prayer and meditation as actually things that fit a certain temperament and are to be honored and things like this. So I guess my question is for you guys who do the historical work as well as those who are looking contemporarily, I do see Mormon mystic groups on Facebook, and I see those kinds of things, but anyone with any clue about possibilities for is it just we need to be around longer to feel less vulnerable to the world, to be able to own our history? I'm just trying to just hopefully push a Mormonism for every temperament.
Historians are really bad at prognosticating the future. So, but are commenting on the past and on what might be. But I think there is something about the longevity, right? Traditions mature, they evolve, it's not even really a fair comparison to talk about 200 years versus 2,000 years, right? And so I guess I'm kind of with Zina though, and I'll just say I have no idea.
I would like to. I think that there are a lot of people that are very creative in their sort of methods of expressing their spirituality, and I think that there are hopeful signs that there's an opening toward different styles of that. I don't know how to get to the point where, I don't really see. Maybe there was like Porter Rockwell was an Anthony of the Desert figure or something. I don't know. I just want to see, I don't, and that's he's usually given as the first of the, he wasn't by any means the first monastic person, but he's kind of the figurehead for Eremitic spirituality in the tradition, and then the people that went to imitate him, and then I think it was St. Basil that said, if you live alone, whose feet will you wash? That kind of thing. So establishing of Cenobitical monastic orders, and then later the mendicants, which were another reaction to what they perceived as the decadence of some of the permanent houses. And St. Francis is one of my heroes. One of my very best friends at graduate school was Brother Rick, who referred to himself as Full Metal Habit, and was a little bit of a rogue, but he used to talk about how St. Francis was his homeboy and was his, the proto-hippie of all time, because he was all about going out and listening to the birds talk about how much they loved God, and everybody was all just about love, 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 and he was just a delightful person to listen to that way. And I don't know that there's gonna that Mormonism will reject creative spirituality. I don't know that there is going to be a parallel to the flowering of mysticism that we see in the 12th through the 14th centuries. You know, I play with it, I toy with it myself, but again, analogies always fall apart because one thing isn't another thing. Even language is that way. It's just, you know, the word is not the thing. So again, I can't prognosticate anything. I can just say what looks to be similar to me in the big historical past of Catholicism and the little historical past of Mormonism, and say that there are some hopeful things where people have been treated well in their sort of mystical adventures, and then there are people who have not received such a good welcome. You know, depending on where and when you are, the same ideas in mystical manuscripts or teachings can get somebody vilified and burned at the stake, or as a heretic, or you know, sort of encloistered as a kind of oracle. And you know, people sought out Julian of Norwich for saying things that were pretty radical for her, but she said them in such a nice way. And you know, and then Marjorie Kemp was just howling and yelling and annoying everyone, but she was so orthodox that she couldn't be kept in prison for very long because she'd always talk her way out of it. I don't know that we've ever imprisoned anybody in Mormonism for being obnoxious, but there are probably some ones you could think of.
The one thing I'll add, like Matt, I'm a historian. I don't have much to say about what's going to happen, but just as a practicing Mormon, I guess I can comment on present Mormonism. And one thing I'll say is I think the temple both resists and facilitates the kind of thing that you're hoping for. Unlike different orders in Catholicism where people are taking different vows that express their different ways of being Catholic, the temple means that all Mormons take the same vows that culminate in consecration. But at the same time, living the law of consecration for Mitt Romney involves investment capitalism. Living the law of consecration for you involves the Mormon Matters podcast. Very different ways of consecrating everything you have to building up the kingdom. So I think in present Mormonism, like your hope is resisted and facilitated by the temple, but I don't know what that means for the future.
Comments. I think we're out of time, so we'll break